I've got 2 dogs and they never bark, and both of them barked from about 15 minutes beforehand until after the earthquake, and nothing that we said or did would make them be quiet.
We've got our cat Pumbaa, and on the Friday night before the earthquake, she hopped under my daughter's bed covers, which is a thing she never ever does, and she got under there and we couldn't get her out, and then the earthquake hit.
These are the recollections from a couple of local pet owners, recorded following the Christchurch earthquakes, which decimated the Garden City, killing 185 people and changing the city forever. The 10-year anniversary has just passed, and although time heals, it is still pretty raw to a lot of people. Even after this time, there are still very obvious physical reminders of the damage nature caused. And as a freaky twist, just as I am completing this podcast, a series of strong earthquakes have rattled the north of New Zealand, and there is a tsunami warning in place as we speak. Luckily, there are no reports of injuries, and as yet only mild damage has been reported. We're all crossing our fingers everybody is okay. Being only a small country, most New Zealanders know somebody in the affected area, so this event will lead us into the topic of this podcast. Earthquake prediction is always topical in our shaky isles, with ongoing research being undertaken. There has always been a feeling that animals can predict earthquakes. In this episode of the Vet Podcast, we throw a bit of science at this assertion.
You are listening to the Vet Podcast, presented by veterinarian Dr. Brian Greger from New Zealand. Join us as we discuss pet health issues from around the world.
There is little doubt that animals can predict major changes in the weather. Birds are known to be sensitive to changes in air pressure and will seek shelter before a storm. Similarly, sharks have been shown to head out to sea before a hurricane hits. Again, it has been postulated to be due to air pressure changes. But what about animals sensing an imminent earthquake? Whenever there is an earthquake, stories abound that animals saw it coming. If animals can sense earthquakes coming, can this ability be used to predict them, giving forewarning and saving lives? Surprisingly, there seems to be very little research done on this. Often after an earthquake, and this certainly happened here following the earthquakes 10 years ago, there seems to be an increase in the number of pets going missing. Some of these animals went missing prior to the earthquake, we are told. Wouldn't this be a great way to predict an upcoming earthquake? Just monitor the missing pet statistics, and when they rapidly increase, run for the hills. There has been some statistical research done on the relationship between missing pets and the occurrence of an earthquake. Most of these analyses show no correlation between the number of missing pets and the occurrence of an earthquake. Back to the drawing board, unfortunately. That was just going to be too easy, I guess. Joseph Kirksvink, a scientist at CIT California, produced a paper in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America in April 2000, entitled Earthquake Prediction by Animals, Evolution and Sensory Perception. He notes that animal behaviour is particularly susceptible to genetic control, and that rare events that sporadically kill or reduce the fitness of even a small fraction of the breeding individuals of a species can lead to the evolution of mechanisms to avoid such mortality. To put it another way, if a species is exposed to a number of earthquakes over a period of time, and we're talking millions of years here, animals that sensed it coming and headed somewhere safe would live to breed another day. These animals would pass on their ability to detect earthquakes to their offspring, and so on. What this assumes, though, is that the animal can actually somehow detect an earthquake. Then he goes on to examine what an animal may be able to detect to predict an earthquake. As mentioned by one of my guests in the introduction, a number of animals display panic in the few seconds prior to an earthquake. Now, this can be readily explained. As much as I hate physics, I'm going to pretend I know what I'm talking about here. In an earthquake, there are two kinds of seismic waves, P waves and S waves. Seismic P waves travel faster through the ground than seismic S waves. These S waves are the waves that cause the damage. The P waves travel faster than the S waves by roughly 2 to 4 kilometres per second. So if an animal is sensitive to P waves, it will detect these before the ground shaking S waves arrive. Many animals have the ability to detect these P waves, but humans don't. There are at least 4 other recognised precursors of earthquakes. The first is ground tilting. This is not as dramatic as you may envisage. We are only talking of a few micro-radians, which is an extremely small angular movement and occurs over several hours before an earthquake. Humans are unable to detect these small movements, but some animals, such as rodents that live under the ground, may be able to detect these small changes. There has been little research done on this in animals, so the jury is still out on the significance here. Humidity changes caused by rising groundwater levels prior to an earthquake have been detected. Some animals are very good at detecting these changes. It is hard to see how this could work for animals in an already humid environment though. Electrical current changes have been detected prior to some earthquakes. Could animals be detecting these? Certainly some fish are very good at detecting changes in electrical currents. And finally, magnetic field variations prior to an earthquake have been detected. It is certainly possible that some species of animals may be able to detect these changes. At the moment, it is hard to find any hard scientific proof that animals can predict earthquakes, apart from perhaps the detection of the P wave immediately prior to the S wave of an earthquake. A 2018 paper in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America reviewed 180 publications regarding animal behaviour before earthquakes and noted that most of the results were anecdotal and very little concrete proof of prediction was found. It goes back to the old scientific catch cry, show us the data. That is not to say though that prediction is not possible. In a study undertaken by the Max Planck Institute in Germany recently, they have managed to precisely measure increased activity in a group of farm animals prior to seismic activity in Italy by placing motion detectors on a group of farm animals. There are certainly mechanisms that animals could be using. More research needs to be done, which is not easy because of the sporadic nature of earthquakes and, in a catch-22 situation, the unpredictability of them. I am sure that some of the reports of animals acting weird before an earthquake are just that, an animal acting weird. Animals often act weird for no obvious reason at any time, and it may be that this weirdness just coincided with an earthquake. A quote from Wendy Bowen at the Incorporated Research Institute for Seismology in Washington, D.C. hits the nail on the head. My cat could act crazy before an earthquake, she says, but my cat also acts crazy if somebody uses a can opener. With the number of possible mechanisms available for animals to potentially detect earthquakes, it is certainly plausible that animals can detect earthquakes, and it certainly would be an evolutionary advantage to them. Unfortunately, as is so often the case, we just don't know enough about what is going on here. There is obviously a lot more research to be done. As I'm finishing off this podcast, the earthquakes are still firing off up north, and now a large part of New Zealand has a tsunami warning in place. A reliable method of earthquake prediction would be such a great thing, but unfortunately, at the moment, I don't think it is your pet dog. Animals have long been predictors for many events. What has your pet warned you of? Message us on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. If you're listening to this in New Zealand, keep safe. Actually, everybody keep safe. There are more than enough things going on in the world at the moment.
To find us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram, just search at Vet Podcast and like us while you are there. Subscribe to us on your usual podcast player, and if you enjoyed the podcast, please rate us on your player and share us with your friends. Our website is vetpodcast.weebly.com. Weebly is Weebly, or email vetpodcast@gmail.com.